Hello, hi, hello. I'm just gonna add my moderator and I'll let people join in the meantime. Thank you for coming. Awesome, hello, hi. Hi everyone, great to see you here. Hello. Wave, wave, hello. I'm waving at everyone. I'm gonna try to wave at everyone, but I don't know if I'll hit everybody. Hello, thanks for coming. Hope everyone's having a great Thursday. Welcome to our first ever buyer-seller hotline. I'm Kristina. I'm super excited to have you here, and we are going to try this out tonight and see how it works. So with this live, I just wanted to create a space where we could have both consumers and sellers in one spot to chat about topics and get various perspectives. So I think that this could really help in terms of answering questions that people might have, or providing more awareness in the market and helping buyers and vendors understand each other's challenges and expectations a little bit better. Hello, good evening, hello, thanks for coming. So this is your space to chat. You can ask questions, you can ask each other, you can ask me. We can dive into some hot topics on the world of vintage, antiques, and secondhand. And I really want you to be part of the conversation here. So you can do that through the comments at the bottom of the screen. They tend to go by pretty quickly if people are commenting, but I've got my husband on the line, hello, who is moderating, and he is typing some comments and questions into a document that I have in front of me. So we can see it as it goes by. I'll try to keep on top of it. If I miss any questions, just ask at the end. If you're a talker, I'm also game to hear from you. I'm up here right now by myself, but I'm keen for anyone who wants to actually talk on camera. We have the ability to invite folks into this room to talk, so we're gonna try that. I think we can add up to 4 people. I have at least one seller who's gonna jump in with me. Haven't done the tech part of that yet though, so bear with me when we get to it. But if you do want to come on and talk live at some point, you can drop a phone emoji in the comments, and then that way I'll know that you want to come on. So comment below, introduce yourself, tell us where you're from. Are you a buyer? Are you a seller? Are you a vintage enthusiast? I'd love to know where everybody's coming from. Share your questions and comments as we go, and we will kind of talk about them live. So before we get into it, I will introduce myself a little bit more fully. My name is Kristina Urquhart. If you don't know me already, I am the publisher of The Vintage Seeker, which is an independent media brand that I started about almost 4 years ago now in April 2021. I'm an editor and journalist with nearly 20 years of experience in publishing content for niche audiences like this one. I am not a seller myself, but I am a very good customer of vintage. You can see a little bit behind me. I love everything about the lifestyle of shopping slow, and I'm a huge believer in supporting independent and local businesses because they are very important to our communities. They're the backbone of our communities. Hey Chisoba, Burlington, Ontario, great. Hello, we've got some buyers and sellers here, awesome, thank you so much. So last fall, I launched the Shop Secondhand directory, which lists over 3,000 vintage and secondhand shops and services across North America in over 130 categories, from antiques to wholesale. And it's also got events like markets and shows and pop-ups and that kind of thing that are happening in the sector. So if you're a customer, if you're a consumer and you are looking for independent businesses to support in this space, definitely check it out at the link in my bio. Each shop has a listing, and you can link directly out to their online stores, their marketplaces, their social media, all that good stuff. And if you are a seller on the call, market organizer, or a service provider and you're related to this space, and you're not on that directory yet, then get on there. It's free to do, and it's good marketing for your business. You can find it at the link in my bio. I'm also running the Vintage Sellers community, which is a membership for vintage, antiques, and secondhand dealers. It's focused on networking and professional development, and we have lots of conversations, just like the one we are going to have tonight, focused particularly though on resellers and how they can make more efficient businesses and improve the lines of communications with their customers. Hey Karen, great to see you. All right, so if you're a seller, if you've been considering joining us in the Vintage Sellers community, you can do that at the link in bio too. Everything I do is trying to help sellers reach shoppers, and I defer to the selling community a lot. They have a lot of incredible knowledge, and I try to create a platform for that knowledge. I absolutely do not know anything, so we'll see what I'm getting myself into with this hotline thing. I'm going to do my very best to moderate this chat. I do have hundreds of conversations with the vintage and secondhand community every year, and I get a pretty good bird's eye view on the market, and I love to talk about it, so that's what we're going to do. So I asked my stories for some topics for tonight and you delivered. So we're going to cover a little bit of them today, and we've already got some ideas for the next one if you're into this format. If you are just joining us and you missed the first part, please feel free to use the comments to chime in and leave your opinions and your thoughts. And if you want to actually come onto the hotline to speak at some point, just use the phone emoji and I can invite up to 4 people, I think, in here at once. So we can try doing that. Low-key regretting wearing a sweater right now. I'm a little warm. So we'll get started with topic number 1. And I think it's one that stirs up some feelings, so hopefully it'll kind of get you thinking. And it is the rise of vintage in big box stores. So there's 2 sides to this, or 2 parts to this, I guess, this topic. The first is that there is actual vintage being sold in big box retailers. You know, Simon's, which is a department store here in Canada, has a vintage section now. And I'm not sure if it's all of their locations, but at least a few of them. And they're actually selling vintage goods within the department store. The second part of the vintage in big box stores conversation is the vintage branding on products that are very much not vintage. They're brand new. So let's talk a little bit first about actual vintage being sold in big department stores. So a little bit of background. On the surface, it seems quite exciting, right? More people are discovering vintage, but I would love to know if you think that this trend is actually good for the vintage space, if you think it's good for small business, or if you think that it takes away opportunities from small businesses. If you want to drop in the comments kind of what you think, I'd love to hear it as I continue talking with my take on that topic. You know, I think I mentioned Simon's in Canada before, and I think what they're doing is quite interesting because they are carrying some vintage pieces from smaller brands, which I think is a really great way to support independent businesses, support independent vintage, right? Holt Renfrew too, great, that's a good one, thank you. I actually didn't know that one, so thank you for volunteering that. At Simon's, Goat Vintage is a Toronto vintage shop, independent, woman-owned, and now they have this space in Simon's, which is pretty fantastic for that business. IKEA Canada in Halifax has done a cool partnership with a local vintage market there, the Curio Collective, and that brings in vintage sellers and makers to sell in one of their community spaces. So it puts vintage sellers in front of people who are shopping at IKEA. So what I've heard from other sellers, some sellers, is that there is some conflict about, selling vintage in these spaces when these bigger companies are run in maybe a way that doesn't necessarily align with the values that are being held by, independent shops in the secondhand movement overall. And I love what Kara in the comments at Rediscovered in March is saying about it's positive that vintage buying is being normalized, and that's kind of my take, and I agree with that as well. I think it normalizes the idea of shopping secondhand. The people who are shopping firsthand who might never even consider vintage, it's like kind of a brand awareness for the secondhand industry in that way. So Kara also said, not sure it's positive for small business. That's fair. Small business as a whole, probably not. Maybe the small businesses that, get to be in front of those audiences, it's benefiting, but maybe not the market as a whole. Urban Thrift says another form of greenwashing, which definitely I can see that. I think it's a way to try to, I think there's 2 sides to that coin. I think some brands really do want to be more involved in their communities, or at least show that they're involved in their communities. But whether or not it's actually contributing to any sort of sustainability on the business's part, I think is pretty debatable. Kingdom of Brooklyn says, I agree, it normalizes it. I find often where I live that people don't want to buy secondhand. They think it's gross, so to have it in department stores normalizes it. I think that's correct, because the people that are shopping at a department store are not necessarily the same people who are shopping at a vintage store, right? Good News Vintage, partnering with vintage sellers is one thing. Selling vintage clothes in America's Urban Outfitters are priced outrageous prices and completely robbed from small shops. Yes, I mean, selling vintage clothes for sure. And then there's also like the thing that we're going to talk about next, which is kind of calling them vintage. And I know Urban Outfitters and Anthropologie has been kind of famous for this, calling them vintage pieces or vintage inspired pieces, or sort of marketing them as vintage pieces when they're not, of course, vintage at all. So that's definitely a factor as well. So the other half of this conversation is that sort of faux vintage branding. And that's, you know, items that are labeled as vintage aesthetic, but are actually new in most cases. So obviously there are a lot of items that are out there that are made to look vintage or antique. That's always going to happen, you know. I think we reference the past to make new products all the time. Hello, Kristina at Fluffy Bunny saying, as long as department stores vintage is the caliber of what we sell, otherwise people could be turned off. That's so true. That's a really good point, you know, and I think that there was, when Simon's first launched their vintage in their store, I believe it was, now don't quote me on this, I believe it was a partnership with Beyond Retro, but I might be mixing it up with something else. Regardless, people were filming those products, and you know, there was holes in them, and they were sourced from some kind of bale somewhere, and maybe hadn't been curated in the same way that a seller would curate their vintage. So it does kind of leave a taste in a consumer's mouth who may not be familiar with the vintage space when they come in and they see those products, and they might be damaged because it just sort of feeds into that stereotype that people tend to have about the space if they aren't familiar with the space. So let's see, back to the new items that are made to look vintage. You know, I think we can't really get away from the fact that there's always going to be products that have a vintage look, and people are going to buy new, whether we as secondhand lovers want it or not. You know, I think I'm talking specifically about the way that we market using the word vintage or antique. And I've noticed this trend lately of BuzzFeed especially having countless articles along and the reason I bring up BuzzFeed is because they have a really large reach, right? Like, this is a big website. They have a lot of clickbaity type of articles along the lines of like 45 products for anyone with an old school vintage aesthetic, but they're all brand new products, right? And they're sort of writing these pieces in a way that make it seem like, hey, this is vintage, this is something that's really cool, this is really retro, which is a word for new items that look old. And I think it's confusing for the consumers, and I'd love to know what you think, the people in the audience here. Like, do you think that kind of language is detrimental to what we are trying to do in the vintage and secondhand space? You know, if you go onto Google, you get new products that are labeled as vintage. You know, I searched vintage clothing before I came onto this call. I got results from Amazon, as well as Unique Vintage, Retro Stage, Simple Retro, and Retro Fairy. These are all new vintage inspired kind of places. There's also, of course, your Temus, your Boohoo's, your Sheins. All of that stuff is coming up when a consumer is trying to just use a search engine to find vintage. So, Vintage Globe, same thing on Google search. Amazon, Wayfair, CB2, Desserts, those were some of the ones that were coming up. There was a little bit more of the pre-owned stuff coming up in that search with items from Cherish and eBay and Etsy showing up, but for the most part, a lot of new stuff as well. Good News Vintage is saying, I constantly use hashtags, find true vintage. So you're using hashtags on social media to find, is that what you mean? Or on Google? I'd love to know. Hashtags like, okay, like true vintage. And you're using that on social media, or are you using it on Google? I'll let you respond and I'll continue on. But this kind of thing is proliferating on Etsy too. You know, handmade items that are using the keyword vintage, and it makes it challenging as a buyer to search, right? And Etsy's addressed some of that by having the hand-picked by label, but it still comes through. You know, it's better than it was. You can find, if you're searching for vintage jacket, you're probably going to get mostly vintage jackets on page 1, but I find, especially with jewelry, as a shopper, there's a lot of stuff there that's labeled vintage, and if you're searching for vintage, even if you specify that it's vintage, it'll still pop up and it's a handmade item, a new item. So Good News Vintage is using social. True Vintage, that's a great tip. Thank you so much for sharing that. If anybody is looking for True Vintage on Instagram, or I assume TikTok is probably using the same hashtags, then you can find it using using that hashtag. Urban thrift, big brands' way of capitalizing on the popularity. It's not good, kind of like vintage fast fashion. I agree. Yes, it is like vintage fast fashion, especially with those kind of unique vintage retro stage kind of sites. If you're a subscriber to my newsletter, you might remember a couple of months ago I highlighted an article. Joanna Gaines is bringing back this vintage 756-year-old gem at Target. That was the headline. So I was like, oh, she's bringing this like ancient artifact to Target. I wonder what it is. And so I clicked on it because like I fell for it. And it was just a tabletop magnifying glass, a brand new magnifying glass. Not vintage at all, but they were saying that, you know, magnifying glasses themselves have been around for almost 800 years. And I think that that's really problematic because the more that we equate vintage, or this idea of vintage, with being something that you can grab at a big box store, the further that we are leading people away from just kind of choosing that in the first place. So again, I'd love to hear from you if you've seen this kind of thing, these vintage inspired items in big box stores, what you think about this trend. Feel free to drop it in the comments. If you want to come on and chat about it, then drop a phone emoji and I will invite you on to talk about it. I'd love to know what you think it means for the authenticity of the vintage market, and if it's confusing to buyers, or if as a buyer you find it confusing, or you're able to discern with what's going on. You know, when you see a product, are you able to easily discern whether or not it's vintage or not, or you feel hoodwinked when you are searching around? I'd love to know, here or later in the comments if you want, now or later on the recording. Rediscovered on March. Kara says, Michael's had a whole campaign this past summer, drove me crazy. Actually, I think I wrote an email that you sent me. Here we go. Yes. Kara gave me permission to share this at some point, so I'll just read it now. And I have it in here. Kara takes the time with all of these advertisements to actually contact the advertiser to let them know and tell them that they're, you know, misusing that word. And everyone else tells everybody else that it's so much better to buy the actual antique and better for the environment. And then Kara will reinforce how antique and vintage is very hot, so it needs to be reproduced, you know, and it's not real, it's phony, she says. And designers should stay away from it. So it's hurting the market, she says. It's not helpful, and I have to agree with that, right? I think, you know, ultimately it's about false advertising, and I think that's what's really kind of disappointing, especially if you're a user who's trying to use, you know, Google to find something. That's really what, when I think I hope I don't misquote this, but I'm pretty sure it's about 86% of people, when they actually are going to go buy a product, they turn to a search engine to do that. And so if you're typing in vintage, fill in the blank here in the search engine, and you are getting a bunch of results that are brand new items, that's not right? Like it's not correct, and it's false advertising. You know, there's no question that a three-legged mid-century modern style stool from Target is a new item, and a consumer can figure that out. But I think that we get into really kind of murky territory when we are talking about products that are specifically labeled as vintage, either on their box, on websites, on online search, in the media. And I do think that it devalues true vintage. And if the consumer doesn't have that knowledge to discern the age or the provenance or the rarity or the condition of the item, and they see something labeled as a vintage magnifying glass, then, you know, maybe they're aware it's a new product, but the actual word vintage kind of loses its meaning, right? And I think that could have a subconscious effect when they are walking into a vintage store later, and then they turn around and they think that the prices are high, right? In my mind, I got this new vintage magnifying glass at Target or Walmart or wherever for $20, and now I'm in a vintage store. Why is this one $100? What a ripoff! Is this just because it's old? You know what I mean? So that's kind of what I think. Let's see here. Good news, vintage proof is in the sustainability of the item and where it was made. Yes. Hello, hi Tie Guy MG. I'm gonna invite you in if you have something that you wanted to say. We'll try this. Okay. Trying it. First time doing this. Let's test it out. And yeah, Yes, Karen at SBK Decor. I don't know why they're using the word. Well, they're using the word vintage inspired because I think they want to, like, I think it was Kara who said they want to capitalize on that word. Maybe it wasn't Kara. I'm sorry if I misquoted who it was. They want to be captured in that search, right? So that's usually why they want to be found by people, I think. I tried to accept whoever wanted to join. I'm sorry if it didn't seem to work out. If you want to try again, feel free. Chizoba, this false advertising also can divert funds from small businesses that take time sourcing for true vintage. Yes, absolutely. You know, if you're a small business and you're trying to advertise on Google and you've got whatever amount, 200 bucks to buy your ad on Google, and you know you're competing with Walmart or Temu or Shein, who is saying that they have a vintage cloak. I don't know why cloak was the first thing to come to my mind, but let's say that that's what and they've put, you know, thousands of dollars behind that ad. It's going to show up in Google Shopping way ahead of yours, you know, with your smaller spending budget. So it's really unfortunate, I think, because it is continuing to push the small business down. Okay, let's see what else. Sorry, I lost my little place. You know, I think one of the common things that I see about when we're talking about this topic, because you know, I mean, I'm not the first person to talk about it, of course. One of the common comments I see is about accessibility and sort of what the prices on fast decor might be more affordable, right? Or people don't have time to shop vintage or shop secondhand, that kind of thing. And I like to challenge that a little bit. Sorry, I'm just going to see what Christine's saying. It's always available and not as special as a true find. Yes, absolutely. Absolutely. You know, I like to challenge the price thing a little bit, and the time thing to some extent, because I think, you know, you can always find great vintage at thrift stores, antique malls at reasonable prices. The time thing is another thing. Does everybody have the time to do that? No. Or even want to make the time to do that? No. And I think that's an important factor, right? Not everybody is going to want to go hunt for the items that they have, but that's why, you know, that's why resellers are great, because you can get in touch with them, you can form a relationship with them, you can tell them what you're looking for, and they will let you know when they have it. You don't even have to do anything. You know, it's quite easy that way. So I think it's really about your intention and what you actually want. You know, if you have time to browse the decor section at Target, then you probably have time to bookmark some places to check in with online, and it's what you want out of it, what your goal is. And I think it's a little bit tied to the way that we view consumption as consumers, right? The way that we view our time, the way that we view immediacy as well, and how we consume and how we decorate our homes and how we fill our closets, right? It's needs to be done now. I need it now. I don't have time, so I'm going to go get it at Amazon right now. We've all done it, hopped on Amazon and bought the thing because it was a time thing. But before e-commerce, we did make the time. We didn't buy as much either. So, you know, part of transitioning to that secondhand first mindset is understanding that in 99% of cases, you don't really need it now. And if you do, then that's one thing, you know, fine. That's an exception, but often you don't. So I think it's like, if this is important to you, if shopping secondhand is important to you, and I'm not saying it is for everyone, because it's absolutely not. But if it's important to you, then developing relationships with your local sellers can really help you kind of achieve that. Chizoba, it feels like the big brands were not expecting the wave of vintage rather than address the sustainability of the products they want to take from small businesses. Yeah, I mean, that's definitely agree with that. That's capitalism at its finest, unfortunately. So yes, agree. Okay, let me see. Sorry, I'm just checking my moderators, making sure I'm not missing anything, which I'm sorry if I have missed anything. Thank you so much for the comments, by the way, everyone. It's really nice to hear from you directly in the comments. If anybody wants to join in, please feel free. I am going to invite somebody to join in shortly because we're going to move on to our next topic. But before we do, urban thrift, vintage finds are one of a kind, not available on multiple sizes and colors. Yes, love it. Agreed. Okay, so we're going to move on to topic 2, which is tariffs and prices in North America and what is happening and what is going to happen and what does it mean happen. Sorry, I missed one comment. Clothesline. Hi, Candace. The idea that one of a kind in a world where people want the exact item they see on Google or someone's Instagram, instant gratification. Yes, absolutely. Agree. Thrill of the treasure hunt from Christine. Yes, definitely. So tariffs, we'll move on. I'm excited to hear from you though more when I post the recording. I'd love to, if you want to jump in on what we just chatted about or what I just rambled on about anyways, feel free. If you're just joining us, please feel free to comment in the comments. If you want to come on and talk and be in a hot seat with me, then feel free to drop a phone emoji and I will invite you in here into this live room. So tariffs are a thing that could impact both buyers and sellers. There are potential tariffs under the forthcoming new administration in the United States. We don't know if it's all bluster yet. We don't know if it's negotiation tactics. We don't know yet, right? It's all speculation right now. And thank you to Bharat Banu Vintage for bringing this topic to the table. I'm excited to talk about it. I want to review what tariffs are first and how they work. For anybody who's not familiar, if you are familiar, go make a snack because this is going to be a second. So very high level, I am not an economist, but tariffs are taxes or duties that are imposed by a government on imported goods. So what are imported goods, right? Anything sent across the border into a country. So I'm in Canada and I just ordered a brooch from a US seller, Courtney at Carmine Hayworth. Hello, if you're here. I just ordered this from her. It is being imported into Canada right now. So that's an imported good. Tariffs are designed to make products that are imported from other countries more expensive than domestically produced goods, right? And on paper, the idea is that tariffs encourage consumers to buy local products in their own country, and it protects local manufacturing and local business. That's what they are purported to do. Importers, though, are the ones that pay the tariff to the government, and that's kind of important to note as we go through the scenario that we're about to go through. So right now, tariffs are already applied to imported goods. Different rates for different categories of goods. Some are currently exempt from tariffs, but the average rate is 2.4% in the US. And so incumbent President Trump is proposing to put at least 10% tariffs on imports, more than that probably on China, and then possibly Canada and Mexico as well. So could be as much as 25% on Canada. Not sure, right? Under our current trade agreement with the US, goods that are valued below $800 aren't subject to import duties or taxes. So that brooch I mentioned before is going to be fine. But there has been discussion about the incoming administration actually restricting that allowance. We don't know. What that means, though, is that it could be affected in the future. But if you're importing anything over that value, and you certainly might be if you are dealing in antique furniture or in wholesale clothing, it may be affected, right? So I'm a wholesaler in Canada, let's say, and there's a new tariff or a tax on Canadian goods that are being imported to the US. And I sell to some customers in the US. So a US vintage store that's been getting a wholesale bale of clothing from me for the last 5 years, let's say, maybe an unlikely scenario because it's coming from Canada, it's probably coming from overseas, but just to paint a picture, since our audience is mostly North America, maybe the store is importing directly themselves. Chances are they are working with a broker who represents them to the government, right? That store or their broker now has to pay a tax to the US government in order to get that bale that they've always sourced from Canada. If they're using a broker, the broker is going to send the store a bill, right? The US store a bill. It is not the Canadian supplier or the Canadian government that pays that tariff. So the hope with the tariff is from the government, the US government, is that the US vintage store would look at that bale and suddenly it's costing 10 to 25% more. And they're going to say, no, thanks. I'm going to find somewhere in the US to get it from, right? Forget it. Forget the bale. But let's say that they really need the bale. The bales are the best, right? It's got the best clothing. They've got customers that they need to serve, right? They're going to end up paying the increased cost for the bale, especially at the beginning, right? If the tariffs go into place and they haven't had another supplier or system in place and they really need that bale, they're gonna pay for it. And then in order to maintain their profit, they have one choice only, and that is to raise the price that the consumer is going to pay for the clothes to cover the cost of the tax that they just had to pay, right? So then the consumer, the buyer, is going to suffer because they are ultimately going to pay more for the products. The small business suffers because consumers decide that, hey, that's too pricey, and they don't buy the item at all. And then there's the other half of this, and that is the reprisal tariffs. So if a country gets slapped with a tariff from the US, they retaliate with their own tariffs on US exports. So it's a trade war, it's trade tension, it's all that kind of stuff. So let's say the US puts a 10% tariff on Canadian imports. Canada responds by slapping one on US exports. And suddenly Canadian sellers who have been buying from the US are also affected, right? And maybe they're getting shipments of vintage furniture from a US supplier. So that's kind of how all of that works. So ultimately prices kind of all around will get raised, right? So I am going to, well, first I'm going to ask you, I guess, if you're a seller, if you're impacted by these changes, or if you think you're going to be impacted by these potential changes, I should say, and if so, how? I would love to know in the comments. And if you're a buyer and you're kind of keeping tabs on this, how are you feeling about the potential rise in costs? Let us know in the comments. And while you do that, I am going to ask Sarah from Better Day Fits in Halifax, Nova Scotia. She's going to share her experiences with working with importing from overseas and explain a little bit more about how that process works. And I'm going to invite her onto this live right now. So just give me 1 sec to try and do that. Hopefully she's like still online. Yay, she is. Okay, I just invited her so she can hop on with me to chat.
Oh,
hi. Hey, Sarah. Welcome. Thanks for coming.
For sure. I've been listening.
Awesome. I hope my tariff thing wasn't too convoluted.
No, it was great.
Really trying to make it make sense for this space. So thank you so much for coming on and being game.
Sure. Thank you for having me, and Happy New Year.
Yes, Happy New Year.
And everyone watching. Yeah.
So why don't you tell everybody a little bit about your shop and what you do?
Yeah. So, hi everyone. I'm Sarah. I run a vintage and secondhand store in Halifax, Nova Scotia. I've been doing that since 2021. I primarily run it online as e-commerce through Instagram and Shopify, and I do markets around the city as well. So, Fluffy Bunny here, we do markets together. So yeah. And recently, actually in 2024, which is why I'm here to kind of talk about it, is that I explored in creating a very small line of my own clothing under my own label, which I made by using 100% deadstock fabric that I sourced from Bangladesh, which is where I'm from, and then I got that imported from Bangladesh to here for branding and selling.
Right. Awesome. So maybe you could tell us a little bit more about deadstock then, and how it's sustainable and how it helps the vintage and the community.
Yeah, so I mean, Kristina, all the things that you kind of talked about beforehand are so it's so true, and I think it resonates with everyone who's listening today. Like vintage and secondhand is getting more and more convoluted in the fashion industry because there was a rise in the vintage and secondhand market in 2020. I think post-COVID, it was always prevalent, but it took a boom in 2020, and now large-scale retailers are realizing that and trying to capitalize and optimize on that. We're seeing less and less actual true vintage in markets and places we source. So I was thinking about it from a sustainability lens and how you can kind of take sustainability to a next level. And so I found this source in Bangladesh where there's large markets of deadstock fabric that are essentially waste fabric from the fashion industry. And as we all know, Bangladesh is a big importer of garments around the world. So I was able to make some clothing. I just wanted to try it out. It's always been a passion of mine to make my own clothing. So I wanted to try it out and see how I did it. And the more I did it, the more I realized, a little part of the future of sustainable fashion that lies in that deadstock.
Yeah, absolutely. So that's a really good example of sourcing a product from overseas. So as a seller who's located in Canada and you're getting something from another country, can you talk a little bit about who's involved in that process? Like, how do you secure that?
Yeah, so once I finalize the products that I want, whether that's fabric or that's goods made there, I have to basically essentially get a supplier, a shipment supplier, that has to ship that from that country to my country, because that shipment supplier knows all the rules of shipping in that country, and they have a little bit of idea of shipping around the world. So what I did was that I contracted a shipment supplier, and they basically they were kind of like a customs broker as well, because they did all the paperwork for me. They paid the tariffs, and they paid the customs, they paid the HST and GST, and then they charged me for it. And then they told me that one of the reasons that I didn't get my product stuck on the border was because they used renowned like DHL or UPS, which are like better shipment companies, and are used to doing the overseas shipments. So they used those kinds of shipments so that it didn't get like the paperwork was done and it didn't get stuck in customs.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's a really good kind of look into how some of this works for, especially for a buyer too, who doesn't know, when they see your product on your upcycled, dead stock fabric, pant set or linen pant set on the rack, they kind of don't know that this is all happening in the background in order to bring it to your shop.
And the interesting thing is that it's very hard to predict what the cost will be. They quoted me something, and then the cost was actually $5,000 more than that, because when they actually take it to customs, it's based on the weight of the product, it's based on the GST and HST, and the customs duty can change from place to place based on where the products are stopping to come to me.
Okay.
So yeah.
Great. Unicorn Vintage, hi. I'm going to come back to your comments. I've got them on a screen here, just because we're talking about customs and tariffs right now. So I just want to stay on that for a second. Karen at SBK Decor is asking if it's a fair trade opportunity.
To do dead stock?
Yeah, to do the dead stock that you're sourcing.
It's not fair trade yet, because there's reasons for companies, and essentially the dead stock shouldn't exist. They exist illegally in the market right now because companies and factories make more and order more than they make. So it can't be fair trade right now, because in an ideal world, there should be no wastage. There should be no dead stock. If I ordered fabric for 5 pants, I should be making 5 pants, and there should be no scrap fabric available.
Yeah.
We all know that that's not the reality. So it's not regulated.
Yeah.
Unfortunately.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. Well, thank you for that insight. I mean, so when you are bringing something in and you're sourcing from overseas, you're importing it into Canada, how do the fees work, and how do you factor those fees into your prices ultimately?
Yeah, so the fees, as I said, they're slightly variable. So they will give you a quote based on what the weight is, but then when they actually go to ship it, based on the shipping supplier and the shipment locations that it's going through to come, it does vary, and it's usually higher than what they'll quote you. So if you go to a customs broker, they'll quote you something, but then the bill would probably look a little different and would be a little higher. Mm-hmm. So you have to factor in that little bit of a variance. And then in terms of incorporating that into your pricing, you do have to, like, I had to consider that in terms of setting my prices. And I was very, very diligent to try to not increase my prices for that. I had to because I'm a very small business, I had to take the hit for that a little bit. I don't know how large companies do it because I was like, okay, I guess I'll just eat up this extra like $5,000. So yeah.
Yeah, they probably have ways that we don't want to know about.
Yeah. Yeah, but it does it does ultimately impact the bottom line. And as like small businesses, we don't want to increase the price for our sellers, because we know that, you know, we're trying to make it as fair as possible, and we ultimately want people to buy our stuff, people to know our product.
Right.
We don't want to increase the price for our sellers. So that becomes kind of a difficult debate in terms of, do I just eat up the cost? Or, you know, do I incorporate it a little bit? Do I add it to my books for next year? Or,
yeah, a lot of considerations that happen. Are you selling into the US at all, or anywhere else outside?
I haven't started. I didn't sell my I haven't sold this branded stuff of mine to the US, but I do sell my vintage stuff to the US. Typically for now, before Trump comes and changes all of the trade agreements. For now, we only had to pay GST to sell to the US, and we didn't have to pay HST. So selling to the US was actually profitable. And I know another business that was a bigger business, and that used to sell to the US, and they said that it was more profitable for them to sell to the US customers than Canadians, because they didn't have to pay taxes on the goods that they sold to the American people. Yeah,
absolutely. If it's below that certain threshold that I mentioned earlier, then it's exempt. And we will see if it continues to say exempt or not.
And I was researching a little bit about that, and I found out that there is a clause that says anything that's manufactured in the US is exempt from taxes in Canada due to the trade agreement. So if there was a vintage item that was manufactured in US, and that was vintage, it would be exempt for taxes for now. That is probably going to change.
Yeah, we'll see. Although something tells me they're not going to have line items specifically about vintage, but we'll see.
Maybe the manufacturing in the US part, but
yeah. So if you are just joining us, feel free to hop into the comments. We are talking a little bit about how tariffs could potentially impact sellers and buyers as well, because ultimately buyers are going to end up paying on the sticker price of items when those tariffs potentially come into place. So we're not sure yet what's happening, but feel free to comment or drop a phone emoji if you have something that you want to say on camera with Sarah and me here. Sarah's from Better Day Fits in Halifax, and she is generously giving her time to chat with us. So I wanted to talk a little bit about ways that we could kind of prep or cope, or ways that sellers could prep, and also ways that buyers could kind of prep for this potential change that's happening. So I think one of the things that I was thinking about for a seller anyway is to, you know, if you are going to have price changes because of this, communicating clearly with customers about those changes, and just being really transparent and explaining like what's happening, and you know why you can't eat those costs necessarily as a small business. Like you already said, you have to eat a little bit of the cost already, and like, you know, at some point you won't be able to increase that amount because you won't be able to make it happen as a business. So communicating for sure. The other one I think is kind of, for a seller anyway, diversifying who they are working with, right? So if you are outside of the US, then you're looking outside of the US if you are currently sourcing from there or getting supplies from the US, getting inventory from the US. And if you are in the US, then you're kind of looking within the US, which is exactly kind of what they want, right, with the tariffs. So, I mean, it's kind of the way to protect yourself. It's the way to avoid some of those higher costs.
Yeah. I can think of an example, just like really quickly, where there are some vintage shops that buy in bulk from US, and like they buy secondhand and vintage stuff in bulk from the US. So and they, you know, depending on the weight, they would pay the customs. They usually do use a customs broker, and they pay the customs broker, and everything gets cleared, and it comes to their door. it's easier than it was. Like when I first started, I thought this would be dreadful, but it wasn't that dreadful. But with the rising costs in the shipping now, I wonder what's going to happen to those vintage and secondhand shops that are sourcing from vintage from the US for getting those boxes of clothing. And that's literally how they're running their store. So I wonder what's going to happen there and how they're going to run.
Yeah, and I think it's a major concern for those shops, and I think for the shop that brought this topic to the table, it's definitely a concern, because if that has, like, you know, the basis of your business model, then suddenly you're changing your whole business model, and you know that's really risky as a business. You don't know like what's going to work out, right? You know, you have to kind of pivot really quickly. So, and it's just a very different environment than the first time that we had tariffs from the first time that Trump was president. Those were really relegated to, you know, aluminum and softwood lumber and things that didn't affect the vintage and secondhand space. But right now, it's kind of being messaged as it's everything. It's potentially everything. So the other thing, I think, as buyers, you know, I think if the tariffs are realized, then one thing you can do is look within your own country when we are making a purchase, and that is sad to say because of, you know, free trade was something we had and have right now to some extent. And I think, you know, shopping local, it's already important from kind of a sustainability and environmental aspect, of course. But there are ways to shop within your own space, shop in your own community, your own province or state, your own country. And if you're looking to save money and save on some of those costs, then that's a way to do that. And you can absolutely use the Shop Secondhand directory to look around for shops to find to shop from. I mean, if you missed the beginning, it's the Vintage Seekers directory of over 3,000 businesses across North America. It's free to search as a buyer, free to list your business as a vendor, and there are some options to upgrade for better reach there too. So I do want to move on because it's somehow been 50 minutes.
I can drop off too, Kristina.
No, I want to still, if you're cool to stay, I want to talk a little bit about helping small businesses to survive this time. Not just the tariff time, but just this time in general. And I know we chatted a little bit about, unless you have to go. No. Did you say you have to go?
Oh, no, I'm okay. If you want me to stick around, I'm good too.
If you're game for it, we'll kind of wrap it up, I think, in 10 or 15 minutes here. But if anybody else wants to jump on and chat a little bit, and I want to come back to, before I jump into the next topic, I want to come back to Unicorn Vintage. They mentioned earlier, I have a vintage store in Idaho called Unicorn Vintage. I'm pretty happy that the new stores like Primark are selling secondhand clothes. That's great. Good for the environment and normalizes buying secondhand first. I've been reselling for 30 years and only seen the benefits from it so far. That's fantastic. If you joined us kind of in the middle, Unicorn Vintage, we chatted a bit about that at the beginning, and if you want to go back to the recording when I post it, you can hear a little bit about what other sellers and buyers had to say in the comments that time, but they generally agreed with you. I did too. I think it's really good for normalizing secondhand and introducing people to the concept. Some people had a few concerns about, you know, as long as the quality of what's being sold in the stores is pretty good, then it'll kind of make sure that consumers that are just being introduced to the space really get that good impression of the space and of the curation that sellers like Sara and, you know, Unicorn Vintage are doing. You know, I think that's really important. We want to leave people with a very good taste in their mouth when it's their first experience with this stuff. So I want to talk a little bit about helping small businesses during this time. Bahar at Manu Vintage also brought this topic forward, so thank you so much. You know, some quick background. Historically, January is a really hard time for small business. You know, the holidays are over, people stop spending. You know, the economy is another thing that we are kind of currently dealing with the last, it feels like forever, but the last couple of years. You know, on paper, it's improved considerably, but consumers are really still seeing a lot of high prices at the grocery store, you know, at the gas station. All of our daily essentials seem still like, you know, they haven't seen that relief yet. So consumers are ultimately spending less, and then January is a time where they spend less anyways. So we also have movements like like no buy or low buy January. That's a thing now. People are really trying to be more conscious of their spending in this month in particular. For better or for worse, it's probably something that people should do all year round, but that's another topic altogether. But our small businesses are the backbone of Canada and the United States. They are between 96 and 98% of businesses are small businesses, and we need to make sure that they continue to survive because they are employing people in our communities. So supporting small business isn't just about buying, it's about community and trust and mindset, and actually just shifting the way that you behave as a consumer and the way that you are shopping and the way that you're purchasing, right? So we're going to talk about that. I want to hear from people in the comments though. If you are a small business owner and you're on the call, what is your biggest challenge right now? And if you are a buyer, I would love to know, and I think the sellers on the call would really love to know, what motivates you to shop small, right? Like what has to happen within you as a buyer to motivate you to want to consider a small business? Like, usually it's, I know price is a huge thing for people, especially right now, but let's say, you can move past the price part. What is that thing that will capture you? Because we know that small business is not going to probably be the cheapest option in most cases. So what is it about small business that really kind of captures your attention? I'd love to know. If you want to pop in the comments, if you want to share, would love to hear it. So Sarah, you have a great motto for 2025 that you told me about.
Yeah.
I want you to share it because I think it's great.
So I have a new motto for 2025 to help shop small for myself and to help my community to shop small. And the tagline is be a contributor, not a consumer. And that's exactly what I feel every time you're shopping small, every time you're shopping from a small business, an upcoming sustainable brand, vintage, you're being a contributor. You're actively contributing to the economy. You're contributing to someone's life. Instead of being a consumer in a big brand store where your name is not recognized. If you talk to a consumer, if you talk to a small brand, if people who follow me, I pretty much know all of them. So
yeah, absolutely. Can you tell us a little bit about your experience as a small business owner right now, kind of like what happens at the beginning of the year for you and what you're feeling right now going into 2025?
January is very slow, but I think like a lot of small businesses, I've been taking the time to plan for the year. It's a good time to reset and be present and say, okay, what's new in 2025? How can I contribute to make my community stronger? How can I contribute to make my profits higher than last year, etc., etc. So it's a good time to ground yourself and to do a lot of planning, and that's what I've been doing. It's also, I think for me, it's an exciting time because I get all these new ideas, which then gets pushed back and not executed as times get busier. But when January happens, there's no markets that are really happening. So, I can plan to join an IG live or to do content planning and stuff like that. So, but I do know that January is also historically a time when a lot of small businesses close. Every January, you will see a trend when maybe one business that you love has said that they are not going to move forward because they cannot keep up with the rising costs. And that typically happens, during the holiday period as well, because it's so important to shop local and to support communities and support small businesses during the holidays. And when people shop these, big brand stores because we all want a Stanley mug, sorry, I know people love Stanley, but, or, those kinds of things, it does take away from those small businesses, and essentially then they don't have enough to make up for what's to come for the new year. There's a few businesses, but the most recent one actually I read about today, Frank and Oak is a sustainable, and did you hear they're filing for bankruptcy?
I did hear that.
And that's really sad. Like, it's not a vintage shop, but when it comes to sustainability, that's one place that, I go to I bought my winter jacket from because, I was like, oh, so when I read that they're in debt, and they said in their article that they were just not being able to, even though they follow all sustainable practices with brands like Shein and Temu, they just can't keep up.
Yeah.
And so they're filing for bankruptcy.
Yeah. And I mean, Frank and Oak is a big company,
Yeah.
like a big company comparatively to a local business,
To
like
a local
what you're
business,
running.
yeah.
So
Owned
it's
and
when you hear things like they can't make it happen, it's I know it's very discouraging for a small business owner to see those kinds of examples happening.
Another
in the
big
field.
one that closed recently in Halifax was Biscuit. Again, it's not a vintage store, but they were in the sustainable small business run by a woman who's been doing it for many years, and they're like, yeah, we're gonna close our doors. So it is really heartbreaking to see that, and then to kind of go into that rabbit hole of, oh my God, how long can we all sustain? Like, if big brands that are closing.
It's tough. You gotta continue to motivate yourself every day, but it's hard, right? And if the sales aren't coming in, then sometimes the decision is kind of made for you. So Amanda Jules Gem, hi. She says, I shop from small businesses as much as I can. For me, it's the connection with the maker or staff, and small business owners have so much pride in their products, and I love learning about them. Absolutely. Sarah mentioned Stanley mugs, people wanting to buy Stanley mugs. Like, side note, you could get a Stanley mug at a small business, but I feel like people don't think about that part, right? Like, there's probably lots of boutiques that carry them. So it is about that mindset shift. I was in a rush over Christmas, and I really needed something on somebody's Christmas list. They asked for a book, and I literally had an Amazon tab open to order the book, and I had to literally, because it's unconscious almost at a point, I had to literally stop, think about it, close the tab, be like, okay, you can make time to go get this. You're going out to XYZ. Just go get the book at a local bookseller, at the same time. You can't do this. But as a consumer, it is so second nature to now just make that really quick decision. I have no time. That, it really requires some intention, some thought, like we talked about earlier. Good news, vintage. I'm a sheltered woman-owned brick and mortar. I do not sell online, so this is very insightful. Thank you so much. I'm glad that it's been helpful. Thank you so much for participating and for hanging out this whole time. I really appreciate it. I know you were on at the beginning. I think for consumers, we really want to see these cool businesses succeed, right? Cool businesses like Sarah's, everybody in the comments, all the ones beyond this, they have the best stuff. Why wouldn't we want them to succeed, right? So as a buyer, what are some of the things you can do right now? You can leave positive reviews. You can recommend your favorite businesses to friends. You can share your purchases on social media. Local businesses love that. It doesn't happen that often, but when somebody tags the small business, I mean, I know it lights a fire in your heart, I'm sure.
I save them. I ask permission to save them. And when I'm feeling down, I look at it. I was like, oh, yeah.
That is actually a really good tip. Somebody told me that once at a workplace, and I forget who, but saving like a folder of things that people have said that are positive about your business or about, you at your job or wherever you are, just as a side note, and then reading it when you feel kind of down or anxious, it can really help. So that's a good tip. Thanks for bringing that up. Providing constructive feedback, I think that's something that's overlooked a lot. I mean, I think in our world, people love to provide a lot of feedback about things. It's not always very nice feedback because people can be a certain way online. But I think that there's real value in like letting a small business know what they're doing well, but also what they can improve on in a very kind and gentle way, because it helps them grow, right? Like if you are a consumer and you have experienced a hiccup in an online ordering process, or you can't find something like on their website or wherever, send them a nice note to like let them know and let them fix it. Like, these people are juggling all the things like you are, Sarah, and maybe it's just something you didn't notice, and it would make the experience better for that person the next time, but also better for the other people as well, right? Like there's real benefit in that, and having that kind of, I think, community feeling with the buyer and seller, and creating that relationship and feeling comfortable and being a little bit more, like I said earlier, intentional and thoughtful about it.
Absolutely. Connection is
Yeah.
key. Community is key. The reason why we are called, I think, why we are a small business is because, you know, we operate within a certain community, and we create relationships. And what I find is, when we create those relationships, they tend to, even if they're not buying from you, even if they're just interacting with you, or interacting with you online, or they see you again in a market and you're like, oh my gosh, I remember you. It does go a long way, and it does boost our self-confidence and keeps us going more, and wanting to help more. So
Yeah. Yeah, you know, I think it's there's something really special, like just as somebody who shops this way all the time. You know, I can point to anything that I own and I remember exactly like who I got it from. I remember their face. I like, you know, I can remember the conversation I had. I know where I was, and I think that there's something just so like special and beautiful about that. And I think it's a really lovely way to exist once you really get into it. So Candace is saying, I have a wonderful repeat customer who messaged me to say that one of my listing measurements might be off. I love that she had my back and knowing that she was looking out for me. Yes, thank you so much for sharing that. I love that.
awesome. And the fact that she actually checked, you
Yeah,
know, and that just gives you validation that you're like, okay, people are looking at my products. Like, you know, it
yeah,
works double.
yeah.
Yeah.
And that, you know, that people, they want to help you. I think people ultimately do want to, I think generally people do. It's just we don't usually make the time to do it, right? Like people are generally cool, I think.
Yeah.
So, like,
They are, usually they
yeah.
are. It's just about the time thing, and the mindset of constantly, we're so the internet and social media and Google, all these search engines has conditioned our human brains to get instant gratification within 3 seconds. So if you're not finding that information in 3 seconds, you're gonna quit and,
Yeah.
you know, go somewhere else. And that hurts us. That hurts the small businesses. That hurts the community in general.
Right. Yeah.
Um,
Yeah, you know, you're not perfect. You can't hit every single, you can try, you can get people to go through your online ordering process. You can do all the things. You can, you know, have people come to your market booth and walk through the booth and make sure it's good. But like there's going to be things you're going to miss. And I think finding out about that from people just helps you serve them better ultimately. And it makes a better experience for the buyer as well. So as far as sellers are concerned, I don't know if you have any ideas, Sarah, but in terms of enticing buyers, what are some of the things that you're thinking about doing in 2025?
oh, speaking off of my Pinterest board and content planning, I am so my when I started doing Better Day, a key thing that I focused on was advocacy for sustainable and ethical fashion. Because I come from such a unique background, Bangladesh, having the lived experience of the devastating impacts of fast fashion, I was very passionate about that, and I used to speak about that a lot, and people really appreciated it. Then I veered away from it a little bit, because I was focused on selling and building those this community and connection. Sorry. So this year, I'm actually hoping to kind of go back to it. So being a little bit more vocal, being a little bit more advocating for small businesses, why we should shop small, why we should think about sustainability in each step. So I am planning on doing a little bit more about that. So you'll probably see me, Kristina, coming on Instagram more and just talking about it.
Fantastic.
But I think that's it. I think in 2025, it's really important, with all the changes that's going on, and with all the economic uncertainty, the political uncertainty that Canada is facing right now. It's really, really important to consistently remind people why we're here and how to support our people, and we can all grow together. There's space for everyone.
Couldn't agree more. Very well said. And I hope you have some new converts in the audience who are going to tune into your lives. Thank you so much for everyone for joining. If you're a seller and you have a way that you are going to be, you know, engaging with buyers this year, feel free to drop it in the comments. We're going to kind of wrap it up here. A couple of the things I had, again, I mentioned it earlier, transparent communication. I mean, you just talked about it. You had your lived experience in Bangladesh. I think sharing your stories and your challenges will help customers feel connected to your journey, maybe more likely to support long term, right?
And everyone
Doing,
here,
yeah.
I'm sure everyone here has a unique story. Why did we start selling in the first place? You know, kind of that's, if there's one thing that I'll say for today, is that kind of digging deep. Why do we love doing what we do? And, you know, sharing that actively with people and being more vocal about it. A lot of times, small businesses, we double guess ourselves a lot. And it stops us from being authentic, because we're so, again, in the social media platform, we're just thinking about, you know, what's gonna appeal more to people. But I think, you know, just sharing your story, and how you started what you started doing and what you're up to and what makes you different from others is the key indicator.
Absolutely. Yes, for sure. Talking about it, marketing yourself, using online tools to market your business. Again, I'll mention the directory again. I know I've mentioned it a couple times, but we've had some new people join. Ensuring that your business is on there. If you're a seller, it's free to list. You know, making sure that you've got accurate information on there. Using it as a networking tool. I know Kara at Rediscovered on Marsh mentioned that connection is key earlier. So did Sarah here. Using it as a way to find collaborators. If you're a seller, it doesn't have to just be, you know, for shoppers to find you, but if you're a buyer on the call, you can use it. It's free to search. So, you know, marketing is the first thing to kind of go, especially during these recessionary periods, even though we're still officially not in one, but the longest pre-recession of all time. But staying top of mind and sharing your story, I think is really kind of key for sellers this year. So if there's anything that you can do to support small businesses, and you have one way to support small businesses, I'd love to hear it in the comments from you, whether you're a buyer or a seller, as we're kind of wrapping up here. So I think that's kind of it. Thank you, moderator, for putting the link there. The link's in my bio. Thank you so much, Sarah, from Better Day Fits, for joining us. I think that's a wrap on our first buyer seller hotline. Thank you so much to everyone who joined. I thought you had amazing comments and questions and all that kind of stuff. And if you want to do this again, give me a thumbs up in the chat or in the wherever, or a heart or something, and we'll see about doing another one. So while I have you here, I'll mention a couple of free upcoming events for sellers out there. On January 21st, I am holding a free webinar called 10 Strategies to Market Your Vintage Antiques or Resale Shop. And I saw that Charmed Christmas and More, I had a few referrals from the directory. Thank you so much for sharing that. Yes, there is a way to have buyers. If you're a buyer, you can go on there and request to be matched with a shop that's maybe selling what you have or what you're looking for. And if you are a seller, then yes, you can get referrals from potential customers on there as well. So January 28th, I'm holding another free webinar on how to use the directory to promote your event. So if you are hosting a market, or you're vending at a market or a show or a pop-up or auction, you can come check that out if you don't know what the directory is all about, or if you want help setting up your event listing on our calendar. Links to register for both in the bio. And yes, if you are looking to have more of these kinds of chats, we've got the community as well, our professional development and networking group. So thank you so much. I really appreciate you coming on, Sarah. It was really great to chat to you and hear about your experiences. Thank you so much for your time, and thanks everyone for coming. And until then, we can kind of keep the convo going. Feel free to leave a comment on this recording after I post it. Thank you for being here. And you know, I think Sarah sort of spoke to it a little bit earlier, but every time we buy something is like a vote for the kind of world that we want to live in, right? And no matter what is happening externally, if we want a future that values small business and values local and values vintage and secondhand and antiques and all that sustainable shopping, we have to help build it, right? All of us, buyers and sellers. So see you next time. Thank you so much for the comments, everyone. Thank you again. All right.
Thank you so much.
Bye.